Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and in this video, we're going to talk about how philosophy works. And I'll give you an example at the end. I'm coming to this question because I'm a philosopher, and a lot of students, or maybe even parents of students, or the general interested public, aren't sure about what philosophy is. They're not acquainted with it. You don't get philosophy in K through 12. So the first time you might hear about it is when you get to college. And then you're not sure, what does it do? And so I want to answer that question here, but I also have another question in the back of my mind because I'll get people from different areas or different commitments, religious commitments, wondering, can we combine, for example, Christianity and Plato, or Christianity and Aristotle? And there's been a long history of that in Christian thought. And so I'm answering that question here with how philosophy is a system. And then the follow-up to that is, okay, so you're saying if Plato and Aristotle can't be combined with Christianity, that they're worthless and we shouldn't study them. And so I'm going to answer that question also. Let's begin. Philosophy is a love of wisdom. That's the first point. That's literally what the word means, philosophy in the Greek. And so that means a true philosopher looks for the beginning of wisdom. Where does wisdom start? And you can tell a philosopher's approach by where they begin. You can look at different philosophers and see, where do they begin in the pursuit of wisdom? So, for example, do they begin in ignorance? That's what Socrates did. Socrates said that it turns out he's the most wise because at least he knows when he doesn't know. And he's 70 years old. He doesn't know anything yet. Or, by contrast to that, they begin in the fear of the Lord. That's where Job and Solomon began. They said the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, the fear of God. So you can tell a lot just by looking at, what does a philosopher mean by the love of wisdom? Every philosopher will say they love wisdom because that's what the word means. But you got to be more nuanced. You got to be discerning and get past the first thing to look to, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Second, philosophy asks basic questions. That's what it does compared to the other disciplines. So when you get to college and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to take a philosophy class, that's what you're going to encounter. That the philosophers ask the basic questions that are assumed by all the other disciplines. And so psychology goes into, how does the mind work? But a philosopher asks, what is the mind? Does it really exist? Is it the soul? And what is the soul? Does it exist? Physics asks, what are the laws that govern matter? Philosophy asks, does matter exist? What's the nature of laws? And so sometimes in a philosophy class, it really turns into a history of philosophy class. That's especially true when skepticism rules in the academy, because the professor will say, there's just been a lot of smart people and they answer these questions differently. So we're just going to look at how different smart people answer these questions, but we won't really actually come to know the true answer ourselves. And that's more of a history class. When we're doing philosophy, what we want to do is actually come to know the answer to these basic questions. And here are some examples. Philosophers ask, how do we know anything? Or what is real and eternal? Eternal means with no beginning. Or what is our highest end? The thing that we want above all else. Or what's the purpose of life? How do we avoid life just being meaningless and vain? Or how can we be saved from evil? Why is there evil? And what can save us? So these are the kinds of questions that philosophy asks. And the goal of the philosopher is not just to ask questions. The goal of the philosopher is not to turn 70 and still not know. The goal of the philosopher is to answer questions. Third, philosophers have a method. Philosophers use reason. Their method is the critical use of reason. So what they do is philosophers use reason to critically examine beliefs and test them for meaning. That's what you'll see in the Platonic dialogues. Socrates is having a dialogue with someone else, and this other person might propose a belief, and Socrates will question, well, what does that mean? And can that be true or not? Is there a contradiction involved? It's what you see in the book of Job, when Job has a dialogue with three friends that show up to talk about why there's suffering, and they go back and forth about the meaning of suffering. So that's how philosophers operate, and that's why it very often comes out in dialogue form. And so, in the most basic sense, reason is the laws of thought, such as non-contradiction. The laws of thought means that if a belief, a thought, involves a self-contradiction, it has no meaning. So if I said, for example, you get extra credit next week if you bring in a square circle. And a square circle is a two-dimensional geometric figure with both equal and not equal radii at the same time in the same respect. Well, that's meaningless then. You have a contradiction, equal and not equal radii. So it isn't that there aren't any square circles, they're hard to find, like a diamond. It's a contradiction, it doesn't mean anything. And you should object and say, that's not fair extra credit. Or if two beliefs contradict each other, then they can't both be true and can't both be false. So if someone proposes a system to you and it has two beliefs in it that contradict each other, you know that system can't be true. But that's also how we operate in showing a belief is false. If someone says, here's what I believe, and we show, well, that contradicts this other thing, well, we know that this can't be true. So that's how philosophers operate in using reason. And that's why philosophy is a great class to begin to learn how to use your mind to identify contradictions. Fourth, philosophers apply the method of philosophy to themselves first. This actually got Socrates into trouble because he was going around asking questions of the teachers and exposing that they didn't know anything. And students saw that and they said, I'm going to do the same thing. And they started questioning their elders. And then their elders said, who's teaching you to do that? And they said, Socrates. And of course, he got in trouble for that. So that illustrates the point, though, that philosophy starts with yourself. It starts with you asking, is my life meaningful? How am I making sense of the world? And self-examination is necessary for integrity. Someone who just examines others, but their own life involves ignorance and contradictions, doesn't have integrity. And you don't have to listen to somebody who doesn't have integrity. You have no rational obligation to listen to them. Not only that, without self-examination, we can't know anything. Without self-examination, we might be contradicting ourselves and we don't know. And so to know things requires you knowing yourself. And the way to know yourself in philosophy means you know how you answer the basic questions. In fact, I'm going to add something here. Becoming conscious of your presuppositions. You may never have thought of these questions before, but if you look at how you live, you can see how you've answered those questions. You can see how you've been trying to find meaning in life, maybe through enjoyment. You can see what your chief end has been. Maybe it's been pleasure. You're an Epicurean. And so your presuppositions are there. They're not conscious, meaning you never thought about them until I brought this up. Then you start to reflect. And so that's a good exercise in philosophy, to know yourself, meaning look at how you've lived and write down, how has my life answered these questions? And now I can begin to do the method. Are my answers true? Are the things I've been living my life on true? 5, philosophers build systems. They build systems of thought. And we can find a nice quote here or there in any philosopher. You'll see that. You'll see someone saying, oh, the Stoics, they had this great quote about how to be tough. Or Plato had this great quote about God. Or Aristotle said this thing about reason. And yeah, it's really hard to find. I don't think you'll find anybody on earth who only says false things. So you're going to find philosophers and they'll say true things here or there. But the question is, how do those fit into the system? And that helps you know also what their words mean, because the Stoics, what they mean by human isn't the same as, for example, what a Christian means because of their presuppositions. The same thing for Plato. What he means by God is not what Moses means by God. So philosophers answer the basic questions, and then they build a system by drawing out inferences from those basic beliefs or presuppositions. Now, fundamentally, it turns out there's only two basic beliefs. And we know this because of the law of non-contradiction. And you'll find this in any system in the world, any philosophical system. It's either based on the idea that all things are eternal without beginning. There was no creation. What exists might change form, but it has always existed. Or, the contradiction of that, only some is eternal. That comes to the expression that God, the creator, is real, and he created the heavens and the earth. And those two basic beliefs are in conflict in history. You can't synthesize them or put them together without contradiction. And they have come to expression in really 4 systems. And those systems that you'll find throughout history, it's a good assignment as you study the history of philosophy, identify which of these four a given philosopher is working within. Now, philosophers can be inconsistent. No one's perfectly consistent. So a philosopher might sound this way sometimes, sound that way sometimes, but at the fundamental level, the basic level, they're going to say their answer to the question, is all eternal or only some eternal? So if someone who says all is eternal speaks about God, they don't mean what theism means. They mean something else. Usually it's a higher spirit that organizes matter, but matter existed from eternity. So I said you'll find these in four expressions, four systems really. Material monism, that person says only matter exists and matter has always existed. It might go through cycles of universes, but the stuff of matter has always existed without beginning. Or spiritual monism, which says really only mind exists. Matter is an illusion. Just like the material monist will say, no, only matter exists. Mind is an illusion or epiphenomenon. The spiritual monist says, matter doesn't exist. It's an illusion in mind. Mind is the basic reality. Or dualism, which says both exist. There's both in the material world and mind. And they've both existed with no beginning. So that's Plato or Aristotle. Greek dualism, they both say the universe had no beginning. And then in contrast to those three all exist under all is eternal, is theism, which says only God, the creator, is eternal. The material world and human souls, human minds, were created. They had a beginning. And there's variations within each of these as different philosophers. For example, in spiritual monism, there's Advaita Vedanta and then Dvaita Vedanta. Within dualism, Plato and Aristotle disagree with each other. Within theism, of course, you'll have Judaism, Christianity, Islam, deism. But you can always trace it back to these basic things. And that's the way to be thinking as a philosopher or philosophy student. What's the basic belief here? These competing systems can't be synthesized. You can't say that Plato is basically the same as theism and put them together. Plato might have some nice quotes about how to be virtuous. And you think, well, Christians want you to be virtuous too, so they must be the same thing. No, their basic beliefs are fundamentally in tension. You'd be violating the law of non-contradiction if you did that. Taking a less basic belief from one system and adding it to another system is, to use a metaphor, putting new wine in old wineskins. The idea being that the new wine ferments, expands. The old wineskins are already expanded. They can't expand anymore, and they break. But that's an image of trying to combine two things that don't go together. Now, let me give an example from the Apostle Paul in Athens, because this really answers the question, what about Athens and Jerusalem? What different things do they contribute? Well, here we have a perfect example. The Apostle Paul goes to Athens, and while he's there, he looks around the city, and he sees how many idols they have. And he ends up at the Areopagus, Mars Hill, where all the philosophers gather. And you know what philosophers like to do? They get together, it says, to discuss the latest ideas. They love to hear, what's the newest journal article? And how did this other person respond to that journal article? That's what fascinates them. Now, how does he begin? He begins with unbelief. He says, I noticed you have an idol to the unknown God. You don't know God, who you should know. The Athenians indict themselves by having this idol that says unknown God. How can you not know God? God's clearly revealed in the works of creation. So he begins by addressing their problem, which is the universal human problem. They're in unbelief. And he's especially talking to the Stoics and the Epicureans, the two big systems that came out of the academy in Athens when Platonism collapsed. Platonism collapsed into skepticism. Academic skepticism is the name we still use today. And out of that grew these two views, which are competing, and the philosophers were arguing about them. And so he says, neither one of them knows God. They're in unbelief. And then what he does is he shows God exists from general revelation, from creation. Creation reveals God exists. It's clear, even though they didn't see it. So clear does not mean they subjectively get it. It does not mean everyone goes around and they have a belief in their mind, I know God exists. And then they act against it. Clear means it's there presented to you, even though, point one, you haven't understood it. You've neglected what's right in front of your face. And so that gets to the problem facing humans. According to Paul, the common problem facing all humans, facing these philosophers, is idolatry. They have misrepresented God, whether it's by saying he's like a statue, a marble statue, or the Stoics said that there's an eternal cycle of all things. And really, they relied on the idea of fire. They were fire worshipers. They thought fire is the motivating thing. Epicureans, who were atomists, only atoms and the void exist. There is no soul, there is no God. And so you still see those kind of competing today, right? But they're both of them misrepresent God, even if they were against popular idolatry. That's one thing people say, well, at least Plato and Aristotle, they were against crude idolatry, where you have a statue you bow down to. Yes, but Paul says you've not known God and you've misrepresented him. And then he gets to the solution. Well, how can we be saved from our unbelief, from our culpable ignorance? Well, that's when he directs them to Christ and special revelation, which means scripture, which is where you find out about Christ and his atoning death. He dies for sins of others. And then his resurrection, which proves who he was. He led a sinless life, and therefore death did not continue to have control over him. He rose from the dead. So that's the structure of how Paul relates with other philosophical systems. And it follows what I said above to show they're incompatible. He might quote a Greek here and say, look, your own quote indicts you. But that's not the same as taking the whole system and saying, well, we can basically put this together. So Athens is, when you say Jerusalem and Athens, Jerusalem is teaching this. Athens is teaching this. It's not that Athens got as close as you can with reason and they just need the Bible. No, they didn't understand what was clearly presented to them in general revelation. And because of that, they're in culpable ignorance. I'll put that down here so you remember that term. Culpable ignorance. You aren't knowing what you should have known. So, philosophy. How does philosophy work? Here's great 5 steps or 5 ways that you can see philosophers doing philosophy, and then an example about how 2 different systems interact. Thanks for joining me.